This is a photo essay of Africville, a neighborhood located on the northernmost point of the Halifax Peninsula. In what can be called a geography of racism, Black Canadians were segregated from other communities and continuously subjected to mistreatment and ignorance by the city government. While a landmark community in North America, Africville was eventually wiped out. To this day, former residents are still seeking reparations from the city government and demanding recognition for its wrongdoings. This photo album will seek to explore the history of Africville and illuminate the occupational injustices committed against it. Occupational apartheid, occupational deprivation, occupational marginalization, occupational alienation, and occupational imbalance are the 5 forms of occupational injustice, and all 5 forms played a part in the destruction of Africville. What is now known as the North End in Halifax was once home to Canada's first Black settlement. Founded by former slaves and Black loyalists who escaped occupational deprivation in the United States of America, the original residents of Africville traveled via the Underground Railroad into Canada. The neighborhood was settled with about 50 residents in the mid-1800s, but it quickly grew in size as other Black Canadians heard about the community and relocated to the area. Originally known as the Campbell Road Settlement, Africville quickly became home to nearly 400 residents, consisting of all ages. It was a poor, semi-rural community, but the people who lived there enjoyed the vibrant lives they made for themselves. A monument to the community, Seaview Baptist Church was a church, meeting place, and makeshift town hall for Africvillians. It served as a landmark to the community, and was where people went to rally when the neighborhood was eventually slated for demolition. The people of Africville ran their own businesses or worked for the railroad, and they paid taxes to the city. In this sense, they are considered full citizens by the municipality, but the government never did follow through on using the tax money to improve the neighborhood. This occupational alienation would eventually lead to the demise of the community. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, the neighborhood struggled with issues like poverty, poor health conditions, and deteriorating buildings while being ignored by both local and provincial governments. Residents of the community fought for the establishment of much-needed services in the area, like water lines, reliable electricity, health services, proper roads, sewage, formal education, and police protection. Railroad tracks, like the ones in this photo, covered the streets, and industrial trains ran continuously through the neighborhood, even at night. This occupational apartheid was discriminatory to the area, as residents of Africville paid taxes to the government and were predominantly rightful landowners, contradictory to the widespread belief that the neighborhood was made up of squatters. The water that was available for Africville residents was not potable and required boiling before consumption. Many signs similar to the one in these photos were placed around the neighborhood next to the makeshift wells. This occupational injustice was a form of deprivation and apartheid. Being deprived of clean water due to the color of their skin, the community of Africville was victim to racism by the municipal government. With no assistance from the government, and many of the residents uneducated or poorly educated and holding low-paying jobs, there was no way for the people of Africville to afford their own infrastructure or services. As poor and discriminated people, they held little political power within the city government to push for the needed development. Africville's severe lack of municipal resources was not the only occupational injustice committed against it. Wanting to demolish the area in order to industrialize and profit off the land, Halifax city officials chose Africville as its site for numerous unwanted institutions, some of which were an infectious disease hospital, a prison, a fertilizer plant, a slaughterhouse, and even a fecal waste depository. In 1958, as a final effort to convince residents to leave the area, city officials designated the Halifax dump be placed on the very edge of Africville. Complaints from the residents were not taken into consideration. In this photo of the dump, Africville houses can be seen in the top left. In the top right corner of the picture, the Rockhead prison can be seen. This deliberate placement of unwanted landmarks, detrimental to the residents' health and well-being, can be considered environmental racism and occupational deprivation, marginalization, and apartheid. Here, city officials survey some of the Africville homes. The placement of the dump on the edge of Africville is a final step in the city's plan to officially recognize the neighborhood as a slum, giving them the power to evict residents and completely demolish the area. In the 1960s, the official order was given for evictions to begin and razing of the area commenced. Unceremoniously, Africville residents were forced out of their homes and their possessions removed by the city's dump trucks. Sometimes, people would leave their homes and come back to find them bulldozed over with their belongings still inside. Forced out of Africville, residents were promised reimbursement for their land and told they would be given proper housing and job training for their hardships. In reality, only some of the residents were paid for their properties, and what they got was much less than their land's actual value. People were moved into inadequate and poorly serviced public housing, and no job training programs were ever established. The people of Africville were victim to all forms of occupational injustice throughout their lifetimes, and its final culmination resulted in the destruction of their community. With Africvillians scattered throughout Halifax, their close-knit community began to unravel. The demolished remains of their homes were lined up along the edge of the Halifax harbour and left to rot. The area formerly known as Africville soon became an industrial area and the location of the new McKay Bridge. Even after its destruction, fellow Haligonians and Canadians marginalized the community and its people. It took almost 30 years after its destruction for the area of Africville to be designated as a National Historic Site. It did not get its identification until 1996, and after its heritage designation, it took another 20 years until the then Mayor of Halifax, Peter Kelly, formally apologized for the city's mistreatment. $4.5 million were donated to establish a historic society and to rebuild lost monuments. Another 2 years later, in 2012, the area was renamed from Seaview Park to Africville Park, and a new Seaview Church and Africville Museum was built. Currently, the former people of Africville are still fighting for justice, and the battle for proper recognition of the city's mistreatment continues. The past historic and treasure neighborhood is being used as an off-leash dog park. The Historical Society is rallying for it to be changed to at least an on-leash dog park. In the words of April Howe, chairwoman of the Africville Heritage Trust, it just does not jive that a National Historic Site is also a site for dogs to be able to relieve themselves. So, how do you feel about the story of Africville? Were the occupational injustices it faced valid? How would you go about changing the treatment of its residents if you were able to rewrite history? How do you feel about the treatment of the area in the 21st century?